She was 22 years old when she stood in the office of a Nevada circuit judge and watched the last of her father's estate get signed over to the very man who had ruined him. A mining assayer named Colton Ash, who had spent 3 years quietly buying up her father's debts before calling them due all at once. Nora Delaney walked out of that office with $9 in a coin purse and a black wool coat that no longer fit properly since she'd stopped eating regularly. And it was in that condition, hollowed out and half frozen with grief, that she wandered into a land auction the following week and bid her last $2 on the deed to a place called Hollow Creek, a played-out mining town so thoroughly abandoned that the state had quietly removed it from its official maps 8 years before, on account of what the county recorder's ledger called, with chilling brevity, total loss of population. It was a foolish purchase, everyone agreed, a dead town nobody wanted, for reasons nobody would clearly explain, but sealed beneath the floor of Hollow Creek's one remaining chapel was a truth that an entire mountain of grieving families had spent nearly a decade being told did not exist. A truth that would not only restore Nora's own fortune, but return something owed for years to the widows of men the mountain itself was said to have swallowed. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Nora Delaney. Before we go any further, we want to say this. If you have ever felt like something precious to you was quietly taken and then explained away, we would love to hear where you're watching from tonight. Tell us in the comments below. And if these long, quiet stories of overlooked value and hard-won justice speak to you, please take a moment to follow this channel now, near the start of the story, so you don't miss a single minute of what Nora finds beneath that chapel floor. Nora had been raised in the town of Silver Bend, a modest but respectable mining supply settlement in the Nevada high country, in a house that always smelled faintly of machine oil and coffee. Because her father, Patrick Delaney, ran the town's assay office and spent his days weighing and testing the ore that came down off a dozen different claims scattered through the surrounding hills. Patrick was known through 3 counties as an honest man in a business that did not always reward honesty. Miners trusted his scales the way churchgoers trusted a preacher's word, because a false assay could ruin a man's claim, or worse, send him back into a played-out shaft chasing ore that wasn't there. And it was from watching her father work, hour after hour at his careful balances, that Nora learned the particular discipline that would come to define her. The conviction that a number, honestly arrived at, mattered more than any comfortable story built to avoid it. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, and so it had always been just Nora and her father, and a rotating cast of aunts and neighbor women who helped raise her in the practical, unsentimental way of mining country, teaching her to keep house and mend clothes, and eventually to read a ledger almost as well as her father could, because by the time she was 16, Patrick had begun letting her keep the assay office's books in the evenings, while his eyes, weakened by years of close work over the balances, grew too tired for the fine figures by lamplight. It was in those quiet evening hours, bent over columns of weights and values, that Nora came to understand something about numbers that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. That a ledger, properly kept, could not lie. And that when a set of figures refused to add up cleanly, the honest response was never to force them into agreement, but to go looking, patiently and without flinching, for whatever true thing they were trying to tell you. Her father used to say, checking her sums by candlelight, "A column that won't balance is a column asking you a question, Nora. Don't you dare answer it for it." She did not fully understand, as a girl of 16 or 17, how completely those words would come to shape the course of her life. Patrick Delaney's ruin began quietly, the way most ruins do, in the form of a new assayer who arrived in Silver Bend the year Nora turned 19. a smooth, ambitious man named Colton Ash, who came recommended by mining interests out of Virginia City, and who made no secret of his intention to expand his own competing assay business at Patrick's expense. Ash was skilled, Nora would later admit, and not without a certain charm, but he built his business less on honest weighing than on cultivating friendships with the larger mine owners, offering favorable assays in exchange for exclusive contracts, a practice Patrick refused on principle even as he watched client after client drift toward Ash's more accommodating scales. Within 2 years, Patrick's business had dwindled to almost nothing, and worse, Ash had begun quietly purchasing notes against Patrick's property from other creditors around town, buying up small debts here and there under other men's names, until, without Patrick ever quite realizing the scope of what was happening, Colton Ash held controlling interest in nearly every obligation Patrick Delaney owed. When Patrick's health began to fail that same year, worn down as much by worry as by age, Ash called the debts due all at once, with a legal precision that left no room for negotiation. And Patrick died that winter of a fever the doctor privately admitted was worsened by exhaustion and despair, leaving Nora, then 21, to face the settlement of an estate that had, by the time the lawyers finished, nothing left to settle. The house went first, then the last of the assay equipment, sold at a fraction of its worth to, of all people, Colton Ash himself, who attended the final estate hearing in a fine new coat and offered Nora a thin, sympathetic smile that she would remember for a long time afterward as one of the cruelest things she had ever witnessed a person do with their face. She left that courtroom with $9, a trunk of clothes, and a grief so total that she scarcely noticed the cold as she walked the length of Silver Bend's main street for what she assumed would be the last time. It was purely by chance, or so it seemed to her then, that she passed the county land office the following week and saw a notice posted for a public auction of unclaimed township deeds. Parcels the state had reclaimed for unpaid taxes and was selling off, sight unseen, for whatever pittance anyone cared to offer. Most of the properties on the list meant nothing to her, but one name stopped her cold: Hollow Creek, a mining settlement she remembered her father mentioning only once, years before, in a voice that had gone strangely careful, the way it did whenever a subject troubled him more than he was willing to say. She recalled almost nothing else about it, beyond her father's odd reticence, and a vague childhood memory of adults in Silver Bend lowering their voices whenever the mountain slide at Hollow Creek was mentioned, as though the subject itself carried some contagion best not spoken of near children. She had $2 left to her name after a week of careful economizing, and when the auctioneer called Hollow Creek's deed, and no one else in the sparse crowd raised a hand, Nora found herself lifting hers before she had fully decided to, some stubborn, grieving instinct in her insisting that a dead town nobody wanted was, at the very least, a place that could not be taken from her the way everything else had been. The auctioneer accepted her $2 with barely concealed amusement, remarking that she'd bought herself a ghost and precious little else, and it was only walking home that evening, turning the small tin deed box over in her hands, that Nora allowed herself to wonder, for the first time, exactly what had happened at Hollow Creek to make grown men lower their voices at the mere mention of it. She made the 2-day journey out to the site the following week, riding a borrowed mule as far as the trail allowed, and walking the last several miles up a narrowing canyon road that grew steadily quieter with each mile, until even the birds seemed to have abandoned the place. What she found, cresting the final ridge, was a town frozen in the act of being abandoned rather than gradually emptied. Buildings still largely intact, tools left leaning against porch rails as though their owners meant to return within the hour. A general store with dust-shrouded shelves still stocked with tinned goods. all of it wearing the particular eeriness of a place people had left in haste, rather than by slow attrition. At the head of the settlement's single street stood a small, whitewashed chapel, its steeple bell still hanging silent in its frame, and it was there, exploring the building on her first evening in Hollow Creek, with a borrowed lantern casting long shadows across the empty pews, that Nora found, tucked behind a loose panel in the chapel's small vestry closet, a leather satchel belonging, according to the initials burned into its flap, to a man named Reverend Amos Kettering, who she would soon learn had been the town's minister in its final year. Inside the satchel she found a half-finished sermon, its final lines abandoned mid-sentence, and a folded scrap of paper tucked separately into an inner pocket on which the Reverend had written, in a hand grown increasingly urgent across just a few short lines, that he could no longer in good conscience keep silent about what truly happened in the Hollow Creek mine collapse, that the official count of the dead was a lie the mine's owners had paid dearly to maintain, and that he had hidden the true record where no company man would think to look, beneath the very floor where I have stood every Sunday and told this congregation that God sees all things plainly. The note ended there, unsigned, unfinished, and Nora sat for a long while in the cold, dark chapel, with that scrap of paper trembling slightly in her hand, understanding that whatever had truly happened at Hollow Creek, it was considerably darker than a simple mountain accident, and that she had just been handed the first thread of an answer someone, once, had been too frightened to speak aloud. It took her most of the following morning, working with a borrowed pry bar in the cold gray light coming through the chapel's single-stained window, to locate the loosened floorboards beneath the altar rail, and when she finally lifted them free, she found a shallow cavity containing a strongbox, unlocked, its contents remarkably preserved by the dry mountain air. Inside was a bound ledger in an unfamiliar hand, along with a bundle of letters, and as Nora worked through them methodically at the Reverend's own small writing desk, the true history of Hollow Creek's destruction assembled itself before her with a clarity that left her cold long after she'd stopped shivering from the mountain air. The town, she learned, had grown up around a rich silver claim called the Morning Star, owned by a mining concern out of San Francisco and managed locally by a superintendent named Virgil Cade, and in its final autumn, a support timber deep in the mine's lower gallery had begun showing clear signs of strain, signs the ledger's author, evidently a mine foreman with a conscience, had documented in increasingly alarmed daily entries, warnings he had carried personally to Cade's office on no fewer than 4 occasions, each time rebuffed with instructions to keep the crews working through the winter quota regardless. The collapse, when it came, had trapped a full shift of 31 men in the lower gallery, and the letters that followed, exchanged between Cade and the San Francisco Mining Company's head office, revealed a decision made within days of the disaster that Nora had to read twice before she fully believed it. Rather than fund the costly, weeks-long rescue effort the mine's own engineers estimated might save some portion of the trapped men, the company chose to seal the collapsed gallery permanently, citing structural danger, and to report to the Territorial Mining Board and to the men's own families a death toll of only 11. The number who had died in the initial collapse itself, while quietly, through a private arrangement with a compliant county clerk, striking the remaining 20 men from any official record at all, as though they had simply moved on rather than died buried alive in a mine their own employer had known to be unsafe. The company's insurance obligations, the letters made explicit in language so cold it turned Nora's stomach, were calculated per confirmed fatality. And 20 erased men meant 20 settlements the company never had to pay to 20 grieving families who were left, instead, believing their husbands and sons and brothers had simply abandoned them. The scale of what Nora now held in her hands, not merely a family tragedy, but a documented conspiracy to defraud dozens of widows and orphans of insurance and settlement money owed them, sustained through the outright falsification of a death toll, left her sitting in that cold chapel for the better part of an hour, turning the ledger's pages over and over as though rereading them might somehow make the numbers kinder. Reverend Kettering's note made clear he had learned the truth from the same foreman's ledger, likely passed to him by the guilt-stricken man himself before he too disappeared from any record, and that the Reverend had evidently intended to bring the matter to the territorial authorities before something. Nora would never learn precisely what, though the abrupt, incomplete nature of everything he'd left behind suggested it had not been a peaceful decision, silenced him first, scattering what remained of Hollow Creek's grieving population within the year. The whole town quietly folding under a combination of grief, fear, and, she suspected, a fair amount of quiet payment from the mining company to anyone still inclined to ask questions. What struck Nora most, working through the documents late into that first night, was a detail buried in one of the company's own internal letters, dismissed there as a minor operational footnote. The Morning Star's lower gallery, sealed rather than rescued, had been sealed with a rich, largely untouched vein of silver, still running through it, a fact the company's own engineers had noted with evident frustration even as they prioritized burying the truth over recovering the ore. The mine, and by extension the mineral rights beneath the entire township, had reverted, upon the company's eventual withdrawal and Hollow Creek's official removal from the state map, to whatever entity held clear title to the township charter itself, which was to say, Nora now realized with a slow, dawning understanding that felt almost too large to hold to her. She did not act rashly, though every instinct urged her toward it, because she understood, with the same careful patience her father had drilled into her over years of balancing ledgers by lamplight, that an accusation of this size, brought by an unknown young woman against a mining company with resources and connections across 3 counties, would be dismissed within a day, unless she arrived with proof too thorough to wave away. She spent the following weeks tracking down what scattered former residents of Hollow Creek she could locate, finding several in the nearby town of Amargosa Flat, including, remarkably, the widow of the very foreman whose ledger had first documented the timber warnings, a sharp-eyed woman named Beatrice Sorrell, who confirmed everything the documents suggested and who possessed, in a tin box of her own, several of her late husband's letters that corroborated the timeline precisely. It was through Beatrice that Nora learned Virgil Cade, the mine superintendent responsible for the original decision, had since risen within the company's ranks and now oversaw its entire Nevada operations from an office in Virginia City. A fact that turned Nora's growing resolve into something considerably harder and more focused. Word of her inquiries reached Cade faster than she expected, and it was not many weeks before a well-dressed company representative arrived at her boarding house in Amargosa Flat, offering, with careful courtesy, to purchase the Hollow Creek deed and mineral rights outright for a sum that would have made her comfortable for years, provided she agreed, in writing, to cease what he delicately called her historical inquiries into the township's final season. Nora understood the offer for exactly what it was, and declined it as steadily as her racing heart allowed, and the company's approach shifted quickly thereafter. Her landlady grew abruptly cold and asked her to find other lodging. The county recorder in Amargosa Flat claimed the old Hollow Creek population records had been lost in a fire that Beatrice Sorrell dryly noted. No one else in town seemed to recall, and one evening a rider followed Nora at a distance from the assay office, where she'd found temporary work back to her lodgings, close enough behind her the whole way that she did not draw an easy breath until the door was bolted. She found her path forward through a territorial mining inspector named Ezra Voss, a stern, methodical man stationed in Virginia City who had, unbeknownst to Cade's company, harbored suspicions about the Hollow Creek collapse for years, having noticed discrepancies between the mine's own production records and its claimed fatality count that no one had ever satisfactorily explained to him. Voss examined Nora's documents with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who had waited a long time for exactly this kind of proof, cross-referencing the ledger's timber warnings against the mine's own surviving inspection records, which he still had legal authority to subpoena directly from the company regardless of Cade's growing alarm, and confirmed within days that the falsification was, in his professional judgment, beyond serious dispute. Together, Nora and Ezra Voss brought the full case not to any local court where the company's influence still ran deep, but directly to the Territorial Mining Board in Virginia City, laying out the foreman's ledger, Reverend Kettering's unfinished note, Beatrice Sorrell's corroborating letters, and the company's own damning internal correspondence in a single afternoon hearing that left the assembled board members visibly shaken. Virgil Cade attempted, at first, to dismiss the entire matter as the invention of a grieving woman with a grudge. But Ezra Voss's official subpoena of the company's original inspection logs, matched line for line against the foreman's private warnings, made the falsification impossible to credibly deny. And within a month, faced with the certainty of a criminal fraud investigation reaching well beyond mere mining regulations, the company's San Francisco owners moved swiftly to distance themselves from Cade entirely, dismissing him from his position and, in a settlement negotiated to avoid the full public exposure of a trial, agreeing to pay restitution to every family whose losses had been fraudulently erased from the record 21 years before. The restitution, substantial as it was, mattered less to Nora than what followed it, because the settlement negotiated by Ezra Voss on the Territorial Board's behalf also formally confirmed her clear legal title as Hollow Creek's charter holder to the reopened Morningstar claim, including the rich, largely untouched vein its own engineers had once abandoned rather than expose their fraud. Nora did not reopen the mine for her own enrichment alone, though she could have, and no one who knew her story would have begrudged her the choice. Instead, working alongside Beatrice Sorrell and the small circle of Hollow Creek's scattered descendants she had painstakingly located across 3 counties, she structured the reopened claim as a cooperative venture, its profits divided among the very families whose men had died nameless in that sealed gallery, with a further portion set aside to properly rebuild Hollow Creek's chapel as a permanent memorial hall, its walls eventually lined with the names of all 31 men who had died there. The 20 long-erased names restored at last, beside the 11 the company had always been willing to admit. She saw to it, too, that the mine was reopened under proper safety oversight this time. Timber inspections conducted by men who answered to the cooperative itself rather than to any distant company office more concerned with quotas than with the lives of the men beneath the mountain. Colton Ash, who had ruined her father through patient, quiet cruelty 2 years before, found his own reputation in Silver Bend considerably diminished once word of Nora's story spread through the territory. His accommodating assays suddenly regarded with a suspicion that cost him client after client, until he sold his practice within the year and left the region altogether, facing no formal charge, but losing, in the end, precisely the kind of quiet trust he had built his advantage on stealing. And so, it was that Nora Delaney, 22 years old and left with $9 and a father's ruined name, became the reason a mountain finally gave back what it had swallowed. It had begun with $2 spent on a dead town nobody wanted, and a stubborn, grieving refusal planted in her by years of careful ledgers kept beside her father's lamp, to let a column of figures that would not balance go unquestioned. Reverend Kettering had died, or vanished, trying to bring the truth of Hollow Creek into daylight, and it was a young woman, with nothing left to lose, who finally finished what his unsigned note had begun, prying up the very floorboards he had hidden it beneath, and refusing, as he once had, to let a mountain keep its silence. The chapel at Hollow Creek stands rebuilt today, its bell restored to its steeple, and those who visit say that when the wind moves down through the canyon in late autumn, it sounds almost like 31 names, spoken all at once, finally being heard. Thank you for spending this time with Nora's story, and with us. If her patience and quiet resolve moved you the way they moved us in the telling, we would be grateful if you'd share this video with someone who needs the reminder that the truth, however deeply buried, is rarely lost for good. And if you haven't yet, please follow this channel so you never miss the next story like hers. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you. What is a time you found real value or real truth in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments and let us know where you're watching from tonight. Until next time, stay close.